Hello, and welcome to Alton's Story, where tabletop tales come to life. I'm your host, Frederick Smith, author of and narrator for The Acquired Taste for Adventure, a D&D audiobook series based upon actual Dungeons & Dragons games. And with that, let's get started. Alton's Story, The Acquired Taste for Adventure, Chapter 1, continued. 3 full days had passed since the 2 elves had begun to travel together, walking west along the Triboar Trail toward the high road. And though the 2 were quite different, they'd started to trust each other as they moved along the beaten path. Erevan, the high elf fencer and spellcaster, was dressed in a finely embroidered traveler's cloak and soft leather boots, the best that riches could afford him. His white owl, a magic familiar and his trusted pet, was perched on his left shoulder, and the polished silver handle of a smart-looking rapier protruded out from the sculpted leather scabbard that hung from his belt. His well-kempt blonde hair was cut quite short, for adventuring, of course, and despite the softness of his face, he carried his chin higher than most, a characteristic he hoped made him look brave and full of purpose. He talked at great length, pointing to objects and animals they saw along the way, explaining each one in as much detail as he could. The fading light meant that they should make camp soon, but for now there was still ample opportunity to educate his friend about the ways of the surface. Idriana, his half-drow companion, wore a modest set of leather armor, a buckled strap from her quiver of arrows cutting diagonally across her chest. The ranger had studded leather arm guards and shin guards, and a longbow in her left hand that she carried by her side, always at the ready. Her shock of long white hair, currently pulled up in a topknot, hung down over the exposed skin of her neck, gray skin that served as a warning of her heritage. Her keen eyes tracked the smallest movement in the grass. In a flash, she knocked an arrow, aimed, and loosed it, killing a grouse, Erevan had called the creature, if she remembered correctly. "Tell me again," Idriana said as she stooped to pick up her quarry. "The glowing sun shines through the days, and these get shorter in the summer?" She placed particular emphasis on the new vocabulary she'd learned, while still trying to wrap her head around all the concepts they related to. She was learning quickly, and considered herself lucky that they both spoke the Elvish tongue, which had made conversation between the 2 of them possible. "Winter," Erevan corrected. "The days get shorter in the winter. And not only do the days get shorter, but they get colder too. Colder than you might be familiar with. With less sunlight, there is less warmth to bask in." Erevan was enjoying getting to explain everything to his new friend. He was not accustomed to being treated like an expert on much of anything, and his half-drow companion thirsted for knowledge like an eager child. "And the rain clouds you noticed this afternoon far off. In the winter, they will drop snow from the heavens instead of the liquid rains." Erevan clearly enunciated the new word to Idriana. The half-drow stopped plucking the bird and looked at him. "What is snow?" Her dark eyes were wide in wonderment. Erevan started to answer, but then realized it was difficult to describe. He looked at the pile of feathers on the ground and used them as an example. "It's like rain, but very cold. And instead of being drunk into the earth like nourishing waters, it falls in deep waves that blanket the ground, like a bed of feathers, covering it quite thoroughly sometimes, especially so in the mountains. It can be quite difficult to pass through terrain such as this." Erevan wondered what else to say. He wanted to offer more practical advice, but he was relying on schooled knowledge, not experiential wisdom. And besides, others usually asked his mother and father for advice, not him. After all, they were truly accomplished adventurers. While their purse had afforded him luxuries that were the envy of many, and his station had given him access to education, training, and even courtly finishing, it had been difficult growing up in his parents' shadow. His father, the Count, was also a successful fighter, and his mother, the Countess, had proven herself as a wizard, and together they had amassed a large fortune by dungeon delving, slaying beasts, and laying claim to treasure. At feast time, gathered guests were spellbound, listening to his parents tell stories of felling monsters on the road, but merely yawned as he told of his training and learning to read in foreign languages and write in flowing script. The tradition of House Leandon commanded that he prove himself by adventuring in the wider world before he could lay claim to his inherited title of Baron, so his being out in the world was only a natural step for him. And besides, the eager elf knew he was ready for anything the road could possibly throw at him. Erevan was quiet now, lost in his imagined glories, as Idriana walked next to him, alternating her eyes between the path and her newfound friend. They were getting close to the intersection of the two roads now, where their eastern travel would stop and they would turn south, headed for the coastal town of Three Towers. Pardon the interruption, but if you're enjoying my work, please like, subscribe, and leave me a comment down below. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to receive notifications whenever I upload a new video. Suddenly, the elves halted, hearing a pained scream a short distance away. In the same instant, two goblins, clad in tattered tunics and armed with spears tipped with animal horns, jumped out from their hidden positions along the path and threatened the elves who'd been approaching from the east. Another goblin sprang out and continued north up the high road, skulking towards the cart that had been traveling south. Malik, the dwarf barbarian, with the shaft of a goblin arrow now protruding from his shoulder, struggled to keep the ox from panicking and destroying the heavily laden cart. Hidden in the scrub brush, Alton let a poorly aimed bolt fly toward the goblin that was making for the cart, and the halfling rogue cursed as the quarrel streaked right over the monster's head. But, lucky for the halfling rogue, if the foul creature had noticed the errant shot, it didn't show any outward sign. It continued its predatory march north toward the two in the cart, readying its scimitar for a strike at the dwarf's legs. Malik, who had only just gained control over the terrified beast of burden, was again targeted by the goblin archer, but the second arrow merely impacted into the seat next to the dwarf's hip. In the same moment, the other goblin came running up to the cart and took a wild swing at Malik's feet, only narrowly missing the barbarian's boots. The dwarf decided to leave the cart to its fate and jumped down from the driver's seat, simultaneously producing his war axe and swinging the weapon in a downward arc that tore through the goblin's chest. The monster fell back in great pain, staggering and sputtering, and died several yards away from Malik. Despite the dim light, the dwarf noticed that the goblin seemed to be wearing a familiar mask that covered half of its ugly face. Malik knew he had seen it before somewhere, but where? Jazzberry's eyes went wide as the monsters attacked, but she met the surprise with equally quick thinking of her own, withdrawing a brass flute from the case at her feet. Through years of rigorous practice, she'd learned how to harness musical intervals whose vibrations could tug at the very strings of creation, a gift that seemed to flow from some bizarre wellspring within her. She rose to her feet, quickly wetting her lips, and began to play out the melodic motif of the well-known spiritual song called Healing Word. The notes soothed Malik with warm waves of tonal energy, somehow knitting his wounds and stopping the bleeding. Simultaneously, the bard gracefully danced backward, gliding across the packed cases and dropping behind the cart to hide from the goblin archer's incoming arrows. Malik saw the wisdom of her maneuver and joined Jazzberry by ducking behind the ox cart to take cover. The dwarf barbarian thought of his small halfling friend. "Let's hope Alton survived the bloody ambush." At the same time, Erevan, the elf noble, was facing down the goblin that had confronted him on the eastern path. The elf planted his feet and withdrew his rapier with a quick flourish. The goblin, armed with a spear, came rushing at him with the intent of ending the other's life, but Erevan employed a sidestep and lunged forward, running the goblin through with the force of its own charging attack. The elf spun about and withdrew the sword in a fluid rhythm as the goblin continued past him, carried forward by its own momentum, before falling into the dirt, dead. Erevan smiled, most pleased with his calm performance under threat. Just as practiced, he thought. Idriana, the half-drow ranger, dropped to her right knee and produced an arrow from her quiver, knocking it to her bowstring and drawing it back taut in one smooth motion. 1,000 repetitions of this sequence flashed through her mind. 1,000 times she'd killed grazing animals. 1,000 times she'd killed wild beasts to defend her territory in kind. But this was not a simple-minded animal she was ready to loose her arrow upon. This was a sentient creature with an evil intelligence that meant to kill her and her new friend, to rob them and to feast upon them. And in that instant, her arrow found its mark. The third goblin died, dropping in a heap upon the road. Alton, the halfling thief, still hiding in the dense brush, had watched as the rest of the goblin attackers had been quickly dispatched. But he continued to lie in wait, as he knew there was at least one more alive among the monsters. The goblin archer was still out there, hidden somewhere in the darkness on the opposite side of the road, and Alton dared not move a muscle for fear that he would invite an arrow from it. After what felt like an eternity of cautious waiting, there was a frantic rustle from the pine scrub, and a terrified goblin emerged out from the tree line into the dim firelight. It turned on its heels and began running away, down the high road, and away from the bodies of its fallen fellows. The monster was not more than 10 paces down the path when it was struck by a bolt from Alton's crossbow, hitting it right between the shoulder blades and killing it instantly. The halfling rogue remained motionless, trying not to breathe. Alton knew the elves were still out there in the darkness, and that they were not necessarily his allies. While the civilized beings of the realms would almost always band together to face down a common threat from orcs or goblins, once this threat was gone, they could revert to their old practices, which, sadly, could involve the killing of one another. Perhaps his thinking seemed a bit paranoid, but after being caught flat-footed in the fading light and being forced into a combat he didn't want, Alton wasn't taking any more chances. Another interminably long moment passed, and it suddenly occurred to Alton that the elves could see much better in the dark than he could because of their infravision. Their eyes could perceive heat in a way that his could not, and this allowed them to see beyond the normal limitations of light. The longer that he waited, the more likely it was that he would be spotted first. And if they were as jumpy as he was, he might catch an arrow for hiding, if they didn't like the look of him when they finally spotted him. So, instead of waiting, Alton decided to take a chance. And that is where we are going to leave it for today, but rest assured we will pick up from where our story left off in next week's episode. Thank you so much for staying all the way till the end of the video, and if you enjoyed my work, please consider donating to my Patreon, which you can find linked in the description. I appreciate all of you, and until next time, please be kind to yourselves and to each other.